Thank you. I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. Thank you all for being here. I don't think it's a secret that I still work for Andrew Natsios, and so whenever Andrew Natsios asks me to do something, I always say yes. And I think many people who work for Andrew Natsios feel that way. I know Jeff Grieco feels that way. I suspect Ed Fox feels that way as well. So when Andrew Natsios and people like Ambassador Bill Garveling said, we really need to honor the legacy of Fred Cuny, I said, of course, and obviously on a day like today, sadly, there is an American who was killed in the Congo, and they found his body today, sadly. And so this is a very relevant conversation. We're going to be talking about disaster to development and building greater resilience, but this is not, it's easy to be at a think tank, but the work that people do in development is people put their lives on the line and go into very difficult places. And I think the other thing we need to think about is that many countries are moving. We just did a paper called A Tale of Two Paths, and you've got 60 or so countries that are moving towards middle-income country status, and we're going to get out of the development business in those countries. But we're going to be left with 30 to 40 very difficult places. So the kinds of places where Fred Cuny spent his career and where this person who died, this American who died, and several other UN workers who died have spent their career, and many people in this room have spent their career. So we're going to have to get better at the disaster to development spectrum. And I know there's many of you who've done a lot of thinking and work on this, and I know Fred Cuny spent his career on this. So I think it's very appropriate that we're having this conversation. It's very relevant to the world that we're in today. This is not a retrospective. This is partially retrospective, but this is also about a future-looking conversation as well. So CSIS is certainly proud to sponsor this, but Texas A&M University is also helping us with this. The George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service, which is at the Texas A&M University. The Cuny Center, which I think is also is going to be at Texas A&M, is also helping with this as well. And we got a lot of support from the USAID Alumni Association and Sid Washington, so thank you all for helping us with this. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Rick Hill. I just want to signal one other thing. I think many of you know that Fred Cuny loved Dr. Pepper, so we have several cases of Dr. Pepper. So to honor Fred Cuny, one of the things you have to do is we have 4 cases of Dr. Pepper, so we have to drink it all. And so I expect you all to help me with that as well. It's actually quite good. I haven't had one of these in a while, so I recommend it. So where's Rick? Rick, where are you? Come on up, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you. So please welcome Rick Hill.
Well, thanks to you all for coming. It's really great to see so many familiar faces here, some people who I haven't seen in 20 years. And I have a lot of thanks to offer today. Thanks to CSIS for putting this on. Thanks to Texas A&M for accepting the Cuny archive and curating it. It's now online. You can search it. Many of the documents have been digitized so that you can actually download the documents online. Very appreciative of that. Thanks to USAID and particularly some of our friends at OFDA for providing a grant to make it possible for the archive to be digitized at Texas A&M and helping with the transportation and many of the things that were required to get it there. It's a long list of thanks here. Thanks as well to the Cuny Center Board, who has worked kind of as their night jobs, keeping the Cuny Center going for so many years. And I want to take just a second to recognize the Cuny Center Board, all of whom worked with Fred from the earliest days. People like Paul Thompson, here I can't find Paul Thompson, who was really the closest thing to a partner that Fred ever had, and had a long career as the head of Interworks in Madison, Wisconsin, training thousands and thousands of humanitarians. Don Crum, who was one of Fred's earliest collaborators, starting in El Salvador, and had a long career in USAID and the State Department, playing important roles in almost every engagement it seems that the U.S. government got involved in over 20 or 30 years. Kim Maynard, who was an early collaborator with Fred, I think starting when Fred was a senior advisor to the U.S. government effort in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It is now continues to do things like help design programs for our government on dealing with extremism in various parts of the world, and also teaches at the University of Montana. Mark Frohart, who you'll hear from later, who started working with Fred in Tigray and told a great story yesterday about perfect Fred story about how the first time he met Fred, Fred was trying to convince some Tigrayan rebel to take out a machine gun, a Mengistu machine gun emplacement, so he could get his food trucks into to some famine-stricken areas. But a very classic Fred story about how he, cut to the chase when it was clear what needed to be done. And finally, somebody who couldn't join us today, Mike Hess, who is still fighting the good fight. At the moment, he's down helping the Marines figure out how to engage with our programs post-conflict down at Camp Lejeune. The Cuny archive at Texas A&M is basically the library that Fred started collecting in the 1970s, and that he and the rest of us at Intertech collected over the next 25 years, and which is, I'm pretty sure, the biggest collection of documents on disaster assistance, disaster management, post-conflict planning, and a range of other things that exists. It's, as I said, some of it's been digitized. It's all available and searchable down there. It's about over 6,500 documents and over 8,000 photographs. We're very glad that we've been able to do that as a tribute to Fred. Our keynote speaker today, somebody that I think everybody in this room knows quite well, and I wanted to thank him for his role in bringing the Cuny archive to Texas A&M. First of all, Andrew started collaborating with Fred in the late 80s, I believe, when Andrew was the head of OFDA, and that collaboration continued until Fred went missing in 1995. It's difficult to think of anybody, maybe other than Fred for myself, I think, someone who has provided more leadership, more dedication, more and contributed more to trying to, and occasionally solving, some of the world's protracted humanitarian crises and supporting developing societies than Andrew. He's been at this for a long time. He's done this in academia. He's done this from positions, obviously, at USAID, including the administrator. He's just provided enormous leadership in this, both as a practitioner, as a leader, as an analyst, as a writer, in so many ways. He certainly had a profound influence on, I know, many of the people in this room, and a profound influence on both how we policy and how we perform humanitarian assistance and post-conflict assistance, and a profound impact on my career and the way that I think about these things. And so it's with real great pleasure that I am able to introduce our keynote speaker, Andrew Natsios.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. That was quite an introduction. We should invite you to Texas to introduce me to some of the academics who don't quite see things the way you do. It is a pleasure to be here today. I actually like to tell people that Fred was my mentor. And I would never have said that when Fred was still alive, because it was pumped up what was already an inflated ego. And I never wanted to do that, but Fred had a profound influence. And I want to tell you three things that Fred, when Rick gives me the credit, actually Fred is the one that planted these seeds in me when I didn't know anything about a disaster response. I came from Massachusetts state politics, and some people say that disaster response was more needed in Massachusetts than any country in any state in the United States, and that was my only experience doing this. I didn't want the job at OFDA. I wanted another job, and they finally said, take the job. We'll move you after Alan Woods, who was very ill, he was dying, leaves, because he will not appoint you to the job you want in the Latin America Bureau doing democracy programs, which I knew something about. So I took the job. After 1 week, I said, I'm not leaving this job ever, because it's the best job I have ever had, and I sometimes would say, historically, it had less frustration and more reward, even though I loved being AID administrator. There was a lot of frustration. There was almost no frustration because OFDA had the notwithstanding clause, it got out of the way, could act with lightning speed. Everybody liked it. I'd never been in an institution everybody liked, except, of course, Omar al-Bashir. He did not like OFDA, and there were a lot of very bad people that didn't like OFDA. But that was fine to have those kind of enemies. Anyway, on these trips with Fred, he would tell me things. First, he told me that there needs to be a strategic approach to how we deal with these emergencies. He used to call this the stuff we move around, food aid and commodities, your humanitarian junk. And I said, Fred, that's very unfair. I mean, it saves people's lives, yeah, but you could save a lot more lives if you used it strategically. And it took him several years to explain to me what that meant. And when I saw it operationally, I understood what he meant. The best example that happened just before I took over OFDA, when Julia Taft was director of OFDA, was after the Khartoum floods, all of the wells were destroyed. Julia sent Fred out, and Bill went out too, and Kate Farnsworth went out too. And Fred came up with the idea, since the wells had to be redug and all this, of starting a water industry. And that meant finding 300 enterprising, entrepreneurial young Arabs from Khartoum and give them a donkey and a cart with a giant barrel that's cut off at the end, and make them water salespeople. And they would sell the water from the boreholes, and this reduced dramatically the amount of time women had to take going to the boreholes, and it created an industry, and 10 years later that industry was still functioning because of what Fred had done. That is a second point, which is other than the strategic approach, Fred believed in the disaster to development continuum. He was one of the originators with Mary Anderson and Peter Woodrow and Paul Bell and Bob Grissoni. The only person of the three great figures in the Central American earthquakes in the 70s who is still with us is Bob Grissoni. He's not here today, is he? I mean, there was a little tension between Bob and Fred sometimes, and with Paul Bell sometimes, but the three of them were the inception of this whole movement of connecting disasters and development, which of course is Fred's first book. So that's the second contribution he made, was the disaster to development continuum. And even though people say, oh, we still are having this problem and all that, the fact is we made enormous progress organizationally and institutionally. Fred was not into organizations. He was frustrated by them. He did not understand them. He would abuse them. They would abuse him. It caused me a lot of trouble, I have to say, because Fred would say things to people sometimes that I had to answer for since he was our consultant. Even though he was right, there's sometimes you just keep quiet. You may not believe me saying that, but there are times when I don't say things, actually, because I know it's very inappropriate. Sometimes I restrain myself, not always. So we have made progress. We have the huge food aid. This is the next reform of Fred's. He is the one who said, we can't use this food aid from the United States anymore. This doesn't make any sense. We need to be able to do local purchase of food aid. We need vouchers. He'd had our market-based interventions, all this stuff. It came from him. And people think I started it. I did not start this stuff. I accept responsibility for it because it's evolved far beyond what Fred told us. It even evolved after I left AID. I do remember we filed this bill. President Bush was very enthused about it. However, no one else was, except AID, to move away from food entirely purchased in the United States, and we do the local purchase. Food for Peace was in the forefront of this, of course, for years. The day I left AID to go to Georgetown, USTR and USDA went to OMB and asked them to take out Fred's language. It was my language, but Fred is the one who told me to do it long before I became aid administrator, which said that 25% of Food for Peace food would be local purchase. And I think, I don't know, Gina, were you the one that called me? One of the OFDA said, it may have been, I can't remember who it was from the Food for Peace staff. And they called me, they said they didn't even wait for your grave to be dug. I mean, they're still in there trying to kill everything you did. I said, screw them. You're recording this, I gotta be careful of my language here. Okay. So I called up the White House, I called up the OMB director, Josh Bolton, not John Bolton, Joshua Bolton in person. And I explained it to him. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I'll check into it. And I said, I'm going to call the White House because I am really furious. So I called Andy Card, my oldest friend in politics. He told the president, and the president said, that's my reform. That's not Andrew's reform. I want it put back in right now. And we're not having any more discussion about it. Call them up. Who ordered this to be taken out? So it got put in very quickly. And the president mentioned in his final address to the United Nations, pass my food reforms for local purchase of food. And in his final address to the Congress, he put in the text of his State of the Union address the line calling for reform of the food aid programs to allow local purchase. He added it in himself. So he was very committed, and it is very useful to have the President of the United States behind changes like that. That is all came from Fred. And finally, he had a profound effect on the 3 Ds. After we sent him with Dayton and Maxwell, that also got me a lot. I almost got fired. I almost got close to being fired by the DART team doing all sorts of things, all of which were correct, but they caused trouble. I'll tell you the story in a minute. But as a result of the huge success of the effort in northern Iraq with the Kurds after the first Gulf War, this is not now, this is 1991, Fred said we need to integrate the military, the diplomacy, and development. That was the beginning of the 3D doctrine, believe it or not. It went way back to then, and he is the one who saw connections between things that, frankly, typically a lot of us we get in our stovepipes, and we don't see these connections. That would never have happened if DOD, state, and AID had not been on the same page on what needed to be done. But I don't know if you know this story, then I'll tell you now. And Dayton talked to the Washington, he told me when he got started as the deputy director of OFDA, I don't want to talk to the news media. I said, Foreign Service Office don't like to deal with the news media. I understand, neither do civil servants, but you have to talk to the news. And he did. The one time he did is the one time I almost got fired. So he and Fred told the Washington Post we needed to create an air cover all over Kurdistan, and any time Saddam's forces went over that line, we needed to blow them up so that the Kurds could evolve on their own, which is what they exactly have. Modern Kurdistan is a function of Fred Cuny. That's why he is a revered figure. When he disappeared, I had 2 groups of people who wrote letters to me. One of them was the Palestinian community in Kuwait, who we protected after the Gulf War. Fred was the one who went into the mosques with, telling me what bad things were happening to the Kuwaiti Palestinians because they were seen as siding with Saddam Hussein, and they were the object of a lot of bad things, of human rights abuses, and we protected them. Fred became a folk hero in the Palestinian community. When he disappeared, I got letters from Palestinians saying, what happened to Mr. Cuny? Okay? And the second group of people were the Kurds. They would write me letters. What happened to Mr. Cuny? He was with us in northern Iraq. He is the one that created this line that has protected us all these years and allowed us to have our own, the most developed area in the Middle East right now, the one that's relatively peaceful is Kurdistan, northern Iraq. Now, Baghdad doesn't like it too much, and there are issues with that. But in terms of Fred having influence, it was powerful. So what they did, they didn't tell me they're going to do this. They called the Washington Post, front page story. This is what they should do. And the State Department was livid, and DOD was livid. They called me up and said, what are you doing? I said, well, I have to endorse whatever my field staff said. So I said, well, I'm behind them, even though I didn't tell them to do it. I didn't even know they were going to give the interview. You need to fire Maxwell immediately, and you need to get that Cuny guy. He's very dangerous. We want him out. Until I was on the edge, until Jim Baker read the article and said, I think that's a good idea. Okay, and that is how they developed. Now, there's been a rewriting of this history. State and DOD are now saying that they came up with this idea. They did not come up with this idea, and I am going to write an article when I finish this book on Foreign Aid from the Bush archives, because I can get them declassified, because they're friends of mine who control the declassification process, and I'm going to get the minutes of the NSC meeting and compare them to the first cables from Fred and Dayton, because they precede any discussion at the NSC about this idea. So Fred had a profound influence there as well. He did almost get me fired, but Jim Baker came to the rescue at exactly the right time. Fred made a huge impact. He had a huge impact also intellectually. His book on famines and war is still in print. It's used across the country in courses in disaster response. I have used it for 10 years in my classes. I almost make it a Bible. There are some mistakes in it that Rick Hill edited it. In fact, it's an interesting story. Rick found the manuscript in Fred's papers after he disappeared, and he called me up and he said, we need to publish this. And and it appears that Fred dictated his books. He just took a tape recorder, dictated them, and then he left it to, who was it on your staff who had to? Pat Reed is the one who transcribed everything and then made it coherent, and then Rick edited that, and we have the book. Well, no one said no one was going to read this book. And so I offered to pay for half of it, and John Hammock from Oxfam offered to pay the other half. So if you note the one-page introduction, it was John Hammock and I who wrote it, because World Vision and Oxfam paid for the publication that wasn't supposed to last very long, but of course it's 25 years since it was published. So he had an intellectual impact that was very substantial. The book on disasters and development is still read. But he added to this Texas stories. I don't mean about Texas. I mean, I'm a New Englander. Now, I know I'm not one for understatement, but compared to Texas, I am a piker, I have to tell you. The stories they tell are legendary. I mean, they're fables, they're legend, they're fairy tales. I mean, you just can't believe the things they say in Texas that New Englanders would never say. So I said, who is this guy? He said, makes stories up. And I was at the events that took place, and I'll tell you one story. We were in Kuwait City, literally 2 days after the Marines liberated the city. The mythology is that the Kuwaiti army and the Arab armies drove the Iraqis out, and that's the political thing that we created. But the reality is the Marines drove them out, and we gave credit to the Arab states for political and diplomatic reasons. Anyway, Fred and I were traveling around because they were getting to beat up and kill the Palestinians. Why? Because Saddam Hussein endorsed the invasion and said that Kuwait can that the Palestinians will get their homeland back, but it won't be in West Bank and Gaza, it will be in Kuwait. He promised them their homeland, and they believed it. Now, I realized as I met people in their homes, as Fred did, that they'd been lied to, but as a consequence, the Kuwaitis said, you have turned on us, we treated you well with respect to other Palestinian communities in other Arab countries, which are not treated well. It's not just the Israelis that have problems, it's many Arab states treat the Palestinians poorly. But the Kuwaitis treated them very well, and they felt betrayed. So they went after them, not as a policy, but as, just because people were angry. Well, there was a young Palestinian boy who was being beaten up by 5 or 6 young Kuwaiti soldiers. Fred and I stopped the Jeep, we went up, and I said, what are you doing? The kid had his hands behind his back, he was tied up, and they're kicking him and beating him up. And I said, what are you doing? He's a young kid. He said, he killed one of my men. I said, what? Where's the man? Well, he shot at him, and he's wounded. I said, where is he? We'll take him to the infirmary. He said, well, he shot at him, he didn't actually hit him. I said, can I see the weapon that he used? He said, it's right here. So Fred opens the bolt up. Thank God he knew how to use a weapon, or he'd have shot himself because he was looking down the barrel. I said, Fred, do you know how to use a weapon? He said, I'm from Texas. Everybody in Texas knows how to use a weapon, Andrew. I said, just wanted to make sure I don't need a headless advisor next to me. He said, this weapon has never been fired. And the guy said, well, he didn't actually fire it. I said, well, your soldier was dead a few minutes ago, and now he wasn't even fired on. Where did you get this? I asked the young kid who was getting beaten up. He said, it was in our house. The Kuwaitis, when the Iraqis left, they knew we were going to get beaten up, so they gave us all weapons. It was in my house. I never touched it. I looked at the lieutenant. I said, "Is that true?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Stop this right now. This is outrageous that you're doing." He said, "We're really angry at what the Iraqis did to our country." I said, "I understand, but don't take it out on a 17-year-old boy who didn't do anything." He said, "Do anything else? Did he kill any other people?" He said, "No, we just found him, so we decided to beat him up." So this stuff went on and on. I mean, this goes in every war zone, Fred. This goes on in the immediate aftermath of a liberation. And we went and Fred became a hero. And so the Palestinians would line up at my base. Fred was bivouacking with us, and I was on active duty in the military, and they would line up and say, "Can I speak to Major Natsios or Mr. Cuny? My brother is missing." And we developed these lists of people who were missing, and we went searching for them. We also went in the middle of the night to different detention centers where the Palestinians are being held and tortured and all that. And we stopped it. It took a few weeks. Fred told me before this started, before we liberated the city, exactly what was going to happen by the day. The first 3 days, this will happen. The next 2 weeks, this will happen. And everything, I wrote it all down because I said, how does he know this? Everything Fred predicted, we had empirical evidence, played itself out. I said, "Fred, how did you know this?" He said, "This is the same pattern that went on in Paris after the liberation of the city after the Germans left in the Second World War. The same thing happened in Ireland during the war with the British over Northern Ireland." And then he went through 6 different instances where the same thing, the same pattern. I said, "Have you ever written this down?" He said, "Well, no, but we should." I said, "We should." So anyway, my point here is, in conclusion, that the final part of the story is, in the diary, it says that there was a company of Kuwaiti soldiers whose weapons were pointed at Fred and me. Here were going to shoot us, and I began yelling at them, and I made into a hero. I wish all of you would read this wonderful diary that Fred wrote, because I look like I should be given the Congressional Medal of Honor when this is finished. But I read it after he died, and I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember this incident. And then I realized he had taken 5 soldiers who never pointed their weapon at us. They pointed their weapon. They had weapons, but they had no ammunition in the weapons, and they were pointed at the ground. Fred, by the time we went back to base, it was a whole company. I was afraid it would be the entire Kuwaiti army by the time we got back to Washington in the Fred's retelling of this story of this Palestinian boy. So he had a wonderful capacity to exaggerate that made his story so colorful and so memorable that I'm telling it to you today. So those are my comments about Fred. We owe him a debt of gratitude. He has had a profound effect on the disaster. And just one last statistic for this book that I'm writing. The OFDA appropriated budget in 1989, when I arrived, was I thought it was $50 million. It's $20 million. We looked up their data, and it had 50 staff. Ollie is here. Is Fred Cole here? Fred's here. Oh, he did? I didn't know that. What about Joe Gettier? Joe's not? Oh, really? Well, we're losing. And Dayton's here, though, and Bill Garveling's here. I noticed, and Dina, you started, and Kate Farnsworth was there on the initial days. Anyway, we had a staff of 50 people. The budget for OFDA today is $1.5 billion. It has 608 employees. That may be a slight understatement. I think someone told me it's actually higher than that. But for the book, we're going to have. Now, people don't give money to institutions that are failing, do they? Okay. Why has the Dacha Bureau grown? Because it succeeded. Why has it succeeded? Because we had intellectuals like Gersony, like Bell, like Fred Cuny, who at the beginning in the 80s, long before I started, when Julia Taft was there, began setting the stage for the blossoming of this doctrine in these days. And we learned a lot along the way. I mean, I'm not suggesting they constructed the whole thing, but we have a lot to thank Fred Cuny for, and Gersony, who's the one last person. He was destroying his archives. I said, because, someone should write a volume, because he has vast archives. He documented everything, Gersony did. And we need to get a record in more detail of what they did and how they did it. and what the consequences are for historical purposes, but also in defense of AID. I'm fed up with saying people it doesn't work and all this. This is complete nonsense for people who don't know what they're talking about. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming, and let's have our panel now.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. I'm going to ask the panelists to come up. I think many who work for you would say we will work for you anytime, anywhere, Andrew. So let us know when you need us, and we'll be there for you. Thank you. That was great. Okay, panelists, come on up. Please join me. Dina, Greg, Dayton, Mark.
No, me.
Okay. We wanted to have a conversation about the legacy of Fred Cuny, and we wanted to talk about today in both the legacy but also the current applications of various approaches to building resiliency programs within disaster and humanitarian response activities. So to build a little bit on what Andrew's comments in his keynote and the comments that Rick Hill made. So Greg, I'm going to start with you and ask you to kick this off. I think Greg needs an introduction, but he's the acting assistant administrator for the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID, but I know you also were a friend of Fred Cuny. So.
Right, thank you.
Yep.
And Andrew, thank you for the little praise that we still get. We're feeling the warmth right now. Feeling the warmth. So a couple of things. One, no budget questions, please. Thank you. Secondly, I just want to thank Dan for the cartons of Dr. Pepper. We were talking about this, and I said, well, actually, when I lived in Khartoum many years ago, and Fred was out there, and we were Fred's storage place for all things Dr. Pepper. And in exchange for that, Fred would fly back frozen prawns for us from the coast. So we kind of had a nice mutual thing going on there. So it was great to be part of it. And at that time, some of you may know, but there was a somewhat, I think we would call it a semi-covert, something, sub rosa, some way, somehow, program of supplying food into Eritrea during the war. And Barb may remember this as well. So my wife, Linda Howey, also worked on this, and she worked a lot with Fred. And my wife, she likes order. She likes order. Fred did not like order. Fred liked what he liked, and it wasn't keeping track in the boxes. But the thing about Fred in those places was Fred used markets to supply food. We hadn't really been doing that. We later did it. Dino will talk about it later in Somalia. But if you know, what Fred did was Fred would buy from local farmers who could still farm to feed those in the war who couldn't feed themselves. And that's a nice story, but the better part of the story is that it's how Fred got the money to buy the food. So what Fred would do is Fred would go to Jeddah with U.S. government dollars, and he would trade on the black market to get more Ethiopian birr so he could buy more food and pay more farmers. And most of us who were, learning how to be government bureaucrats, we wouldn't have done that. But Fred did that, and because everything was classified about the program, well, nobody really knew what Fred was doing.
So the statute of limitations are over, right? I'm just checking. Okay,
It had nothing to do with me, Dan.
Right,
I was working out in Darfur, so I'm good. But I'd still like to spend time with my wife, so I'm just saying that. So I think the important thing there was Fred early on understood the power of markets and the fact that people are not victims and that conflict is not, everybody is not all the same, right? We're affected by it, but we're not all affected by it the same. We can look at South Sudan and the way years later, we started to use farmers there who had a surplus to feed other people. And that idea came from Fred. So one of the things that Dan asked me about was, this really relates to this whole concept of resilience, which I know we use the word a lot, but I take a great deal of pride from when Bill Garvelink and I were in at the Bureau for Food Security when we started Feed the Future, and we began to try to push this concept that we could do more to bring development and relief together. And really, if you think about it, as Andrew said, it was really a concept that Fred had early on recognized. So as I fast forward to now, what I see is the heavy use of markets now, right? I mean, what we do in Food for Peace, we move for cash. I was just up on Capitol Hill with Senate Foreign Relations. If they had their way, we'd get all cash now, if Senator Corker had his way. So that's what we're moving toward now, which means if we're doing that, we are using markets, which means that if you take Fred's ideas about relief and development, what you're doing is you're doing those things simultaneously. It's not I think what we realize, it's not we're doing one thing now and then we're going to do this thing later. It is that we can try within that context to do all those things. Obviously, it takes very good order. It takes creativity, and that's the kind of thing I think that Fred had. So we can always do better. We can always plan further ahead. But I think that a lot of the things that we do now are an outgrowth of the things that many of us fortunately worked with Fred on years ago and now have been able to bring them to fruition. So, stop.
Thanks, Greg. You've earned your Dr. Pepper. That's excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so Dayton, you're the principal subject matter expert for the Global Strategy Group at the International Preparedness Associates, Inc. But I suspect that's not, I know you're also a friend of Fred's, but tell us, why are you in this at this panel other than the fact you have the longest title of anyone that we've ever had at CSIS? So Dayton, please, and tell us a little bit about how you knew Fred, and also a little bit about how his thinking and practice is relevant for today. Thank you.
You've told everybody here that you're extending the closing time for this session so we can all talk about Fred.
Correct.
I'd like to put it in the context that Andrew pointed out in his opening remarks, the 3D approach, and just say the same thing that Andrew did, that Fred Cuny from the very beginning was looking at the whole picture, the whole of government picture, which we use frequently for talking about, for devising his strategies when he went to the field. So what I'd like to do is talk about, just give you a couple of anecdotes of when I was with Fred in 3 different places where he used his whole of government 3D approach to devise his strategies. Northern Iraq that Andrew talked about, where we just about had him fired. You never told me that, by the way, when I was out there too long, I guess. And the deployment to the Soviet Union at the time of the Gorbachev coup, and Fred was the key advisor for that, where we were converted from doing just simply an assessment to managing the military airlift of all kinds of commodities that the military wanted to get rid of out of their warehouses to the Soviet Union. And the third one was in Sarajevo. I worked with Fred in Sarajevo in 1994. At any rate, the first anecdote, and Andrew talked about how Fred was very outspoken, and obviously he was controversial because he got us all in trouble. When I walked in Salopi, into the military compound where they had set up all their Gs and the G1, G2 through G9 sets of offices in Salopi and managing the Northern Iraq intervention. One day we were sitting there and in comes this Brigadier General, "Where's Fred Cuny?" And I didn't want to let anybody know that I knew Fred Cuny with that kind of a voice. he had obviously said something, and maybe this was some of the same things he was saying that got Andrew in trouble, about what wasn't going right in our intervention. He felt, for example, that we needed a lot more tents, and the military needed to get a lot more tents into northern Iraq. His strategy to bring the Kurds down from the mountains was an extremely effective strategy. The Kurds refused to come down off the mountains. They were dying at the rate of 100 a day, and they were refusing to come down. Fred devised a strategy, said to the military there, and General Garner was the general that was on the ground in Dahuk. General Garner sent the Peshmerga to us, to Fred and I, to talk about what we were going to do. Fred said that if you start bringing the leaders of the Peshmerga on the mountains down to take a look, they're going to get an idea that maybe it's pretty safe for them to come back. The next step was to invite 100 of the Peshmerga off the mountains down to help us build the tent camps. And that was accepted by the Peshmerga. So 100 of them came down and to build the camps. Well, within 3 days, 2 to 3 days, there was a spontaneous repatriation of the Kurds off the mountains on their own. We're looking up in the mountains and looking at the headlights of the vehicles coming down off the mountains. It was really a tremendous sight. And that was Fred's strategy to get the Kurds down. Then he said, I said, well, how long are we going to be able to, how long is it going to take us to fix all this? And he said, oh, about 2 months. I gave that to the Washington Post. Nobody in Washington had heard about some time frame where we could get to redeploy the military out of northern Iraq. Nobody had heard that. I don't know if that caused you some trouble too. That was part of the interview. So Fred really worked with the military very, very closely, and that was one of the more successful interventions, the northern Iraq. Going to the USSR assessment, I won't spend too much time on that, but again, brilliance. When the U.S. decided, and Gene Dewey was running our side of it in Washington with General Armitage, was it? We had decided to bring all kinds of excess military commodities as part of the humanitarian assistance to Russia. And the planes, before the planes arrived, Fred said, well, we've got to have some way to monitor how the Russians handle all this. He hired American students who spoke Russian to join these convoys of the Russian convoys that were taking these commodities to various places that they were going to be distributed. And the types of stuff that they were getting was really, some of it was really bad. Rusty food tins, size pajama 40 pajama bottoms with no tops. Just quite a just getting rid of stuff that they wanted out of the warehouses. Fred rescued that, what could have been a disaster in public relations. He rescued that by having the monitors, and the press started following the American students joining the convoys as being their the way they were going to get information, rather than focusing on the value of the commodities. That was Fred again. The third one, Sarajevo. I remember going one time, invited to Fred's place, where General Jim Jones, who was a brigadier general at that time, he was the Marine colonel in northern Iraq, at his house, and we had long, drawn-out discussions into the night. Jim Jones really liked to talk with Fred. Jim Jones was a UCOM general back then, J5 or something like that. But Fred got into serious trouble in Sarajevo, and that's what led to his dismissal by the Soros Foundation that was employing him there. By getting angry, the host, the Bosnian government. One night, the UN Special Representative, Ambassador Eagleton, invited myself, Fred, and the government Minister of Reconstruction to a dinner, just 4 or 5 of us. And boy, this government minister railed against, he didn't mention Fred by name, but everything that Fred had been doing, trying to set up the whole water system to supply the town with water, which was kind of against the enterprise of selling water that was set up by the government. Some people were losing money because he was setting up a water system, give them free water into the water system in Sarajevo. This minister just railed against Fred right and left during this dinner with Ambassador Eagleton. So Fred was controversial in everything that, in a lot of things that he did, but he was really thinking way ahead of all of us. Those are my 3 anecdotes. And again, the conclusion that Andrew focused on, the 3 Ds really came about, not because of Fred, they came about after he was long gone, but he was thinking way ahead about the 3D requirement during his lifetime, and we all learned from it. He mentored me too, obviously. I was the nominal team leader in the OFTA teams out there, the DART teams. He ran things. And I just accepted that he was going to have the intellectual power to run things. That was the best way to operate out there, even though it got us all into a bit of trouble occasionally. Okay, I've gone over my time.
Thank you, Dayton. Thank you very much. Dina, thanks for being here. You're now in private life as a consultant, but you had, most recently, you were head of Food for Peace for 6 years, and you were also a deputy assistant administrator in Dacha as well. So thanks for being here. And you knew Fred Cuny as well.
Thanks for having me, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here who we've all worked together in the past to remember Fred and to think about how his legacy is playing out today and so many of the emergencies we have around the world. Yes, I met Fred in the early 90s. I was the lead action officer in OFDA. Andrew was the head of the bureau. Jim Kunder was the OFDA director. And we were dealing with a famine in Somalia, the 1991 Somalia famine, and I was the lead officer. Fred was the architect at that time for one of our signature programs, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in the early 90s, he was based in Mombasa for that program, but he came through Washington often, and he would always stop by my office, I think in part because he knew he had a ready ear, somebody who'd listen to his ideas as well as his complaints in a city that did not always look kindly on his maverick approach to things. I also had the privilege of traveling with him throughout Somalia in the 90s, looking at that unfolding tragedy through his expert eyes. I think more than 150,000 people died in Somalia at that time. During our time in cars and on planes, he talked a lot about what he knew about famine. I mean, he mentored me as he did so many others. And he also, something that wasn't on my radar, gave me long lectures about the impact of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and its impacts for future conflicts all over the world. And it really was prescient, some of the things he was talking about. It was clear to me at the time that even though we were bouncing around in remote reaches of Somalia, he had already had set his sights to different places. There was one thing that I remember well. I was in a refugee camp, or a displaced persons camp, a tented village, filled with people who'd migrated out of rural areas in search of food. And it was a hive of activity, lots of people moving around, a little bit chaotic, as a lot of times those places are. And he said to me, he leaned over and he said, if you really want to know what's going on in this place, look inside the tents. And so with the permission of our hosts, we did. And in virtually every one of them, we saw bone-thin adults emaciated, too weak to move. And that was the famine, right there, happening quietly while all of this other activity going on around us. And those are images I'll certainly never forget. It was Fred who told me that there is more often than not food available in famine settings. That was a truth that was very hard, and to this day is very difficult to explain to people. And that if we could just use the market in the right way, we could drive prices down, force people who are hoarding food to release it, and make it more available to those who couldn't afford it. And so he and his team were facilitating what we then called a monetization program, where we were trying to sell relief food to traders in Mombasa to bring it in to Somalia, and with the idea that it would drive prices down and that they would have the ability to access areas we couldn't to help people who were starving. And Andrew really used to be credited for trying this, because you can imagine, still controversial today, starving people, you're going to sell the relief food rather than just give it to people who need it. Trying to convince people that's a good idea. And the optics of that to this day are still challenging, and we tried to do it again in 2011. Difficult sell for most, I would say 99% of the partners we went to think about it. That program had very mixed results, but the concept lived well beyond it. And today, USAID's Food for Peace office has an approach that we call the MAP approach, Market Availability Programs. And we use the term MAP to distinguish it from the monetization that we used in development programs, which was much maligned and probably the topic of a different conference. But we used the MAP approach to good effect in the early to mid 2000s in Zimbabwe, when we were trying to drive prices down and make grains more affordable to the urban poor. And then we tried the monetization program again in Somalia in the famine of 2011, where we were selling food to traders to drive prices down. There is a really interesting evaluation of that program on the FuseNet website if you're interested. We were able to generate a small but measurable impact on sorghum prices. More successful, I would say, and Andrew alluded to it though, is these other market-based interventions, which are now prevalent all over the world. And that's really this idea of providing cash transfers or food vouchers to vulnerable populations, letting the market take care of itself, where traders are bringing food in and you're creating the demand for it that incentivizes them to go into hard-to-reach areas. We had a lot of success with that in the 2011 Somalia famine response. And you are seeing, of course, the rise of cash-based programs all over the world. So if Fred were alive today, I think there are a couple things he would be super impressed with. One is this shift to cash-based food assistance. Andrew mentioned the growing budget of OFDA. Food for Peace's program has more than doubled in the last 6 years, and roughly 50% of it now is for cash-based food assistance. And that 50% is $1 billion. It's just enormous. It's being used at scale in response to the Syria crisis. Virtually all the refugees are using debit cards. They can walk into a grocery store to access healthful foods. And we're doing local procurement in Turkey to provide for displaced people inside. I think you're also seeing improved context analysis because, and this was something Fred was just avid about, understand, take time to really look at the full dimensions of a problem before you come and start throwing things at it. And because our partners now can use cash transfers, food vouchers, local and regional procurement, they've got to figure out what's the most effective approach. And so you have this huge improvement in context analysis and also regular price monitoring, which Fred 2 decades ago was telling us we need to regularly monitor prices. That you're seeing that happen. I think even when we do use food now, we're buying it on world markets at low prices, and we're pre-positioning it closer to disasters. So the things he hated about in-kind food, it's always late, it's too expensive, all of these things we have when international food is needed. You're really seeing, I think, a much improved response with those. On nutrition, he often said, stop giving people grains when what they really need is specialized and healthful, nutritious foods. I think he would be super impressed by the improvements in the blended food products and the wide use of ready-to-use therapeutic foods, which, of course, have dramatically cut malnutrition rates. Greg talked about the resilience agenda, which is absolutely, filled with so many of the concepts that Fred endorsed. A lot of things left undone. I think they have a lot to complain about if he were still here too. And I think many of you are well familiar with those challenges. I think I would just close in saying, that at the first memorial gathering for Fred in the early 90s, I was maybe 5-6 years into my career, a young officer that I felt not just sad, but super cheated, because I had spent some time with him, and I really felt like this is a guy I'm going to continue to learn from. I can continue to enjoy and be challenged by, his view of the world. So I still, all these years later, feel the poorer for his absence, but also richer for having been influenced by both his friendship and by his vision. So thank you to you for keeping this alive.
Thank you, Dina. Mark Frohart, you're the Senior Vice President for Strategic Practice at Internews, but I suspect that's not necessarily the hat you're wearing for this conversation.
No, a little bit. I mean, some of the most recent work, but I knew that Andrew was going to do an incredible job, but the number of stories that he told and the way he told them, he really blew up my presentation completely. And everybody here has followed by there's no ribbonets left, so I'm just going to kind of respond to some things that have been said. I think that, with some of the things that Andrew said with regard to Fred's approach, and I think one of the things, and Kim and I were talking about this last night, is what made him different, why was he famous, for example. And I think a lot of it was that he was an exceptionally intelligent, and for me, a purely logical, a very, very logical person. But he also was audacious. He was an iconoclast. As you said with regard to organizations, he really didn't care about following the rules. When he entered into a situation, he looked at it broadly. He looked at what really needed to be done, and then he used whatever resources and individuals, no matter what organization they worked for or what their mandate was. He identified what were the resources and the individuals that were present and ready to actually be deployed. And I think that some of the things with regard to that were mentioned earlier, I just have to tell the second half of some of these stories. When I first met Fred, it was in 1985, and there was the influx of refugees that were coming out of Eritrea and Tigray into Sudan. And I was with UNHCR, and I arrived in Khartoum, and there was an emergency management consultant who said, well, when you get out to the east, there's this guy out there by the name of Fred Cuny, and he's really the one who's kind of laying out the plans along this 1,000-mile border or whatever with 350,000 refugees coming in. And he's the one who's designing the camps and all the rest. But the one thing you have to be careful about is that, once you get out there, it probably won't be long before he has you refueling his airplane. And I was like, what do you mean he rented an airplane? Well, no, he actually took his airplane from Texas, took it apart, put it in the back of, I think it was a C-141 or something, and had somebody fly it over, which was only one of the stories. I think someone else might even be here that was responsible for strapping a case of Dr. Pepper to a pallet of food for an airdrop out of the back of a C-130 as well. So he had his few stories. But in any case, one of the first things that I saw in working with Fred was his ability to innovate. Is that when we came out and we looked at some of the first camps that had been set up, there was a real problem with depression in the camps. And the reason why I'm saying that, it was yes, their death rates were very high. I think there were something like 10 per 10,000 per day, and which is quite high for even a refugee situation. But people really were morose. There was just no activity. There was no interaction. All the tents were in lines, and it was really hard to motivate people to actually start to participate in what was necessary as far as distribution of assistance. And one of the camps that I was to be set up, 3 of the camps that I was to set up, I was told by Fred, who I met, as Rick mentioned, I walked up behind him after one of the first meetings, and everyone else was talking to all the UN officials and all the rest. He was over talking to the rebels about why can't you take out, a post that is, inhibiting aid. And he told me that, and we talked about the layout of the camp, and he told me that, well, I'd laid it out in circles. And I was like, well, how did you get, a team of Sudanese surveyors who don't even have stakes to put in the ground? They just make little piles of earth of where the tent should go, to lay out something like circles for 4,000 to 7,000 tents. And he said, well, when you get out there, you'll see. Just kick off, you'll see the squares. Just kick off the corners. And so I went out and I looked and I saw that he had created squares, 4 points with 2 tents in between every corner. And they asked us to go out, you knocked off the corners, and then you had 8 points that were formed into a circle. And so when we dumped all the tents, and when people came out and they started to arrive and they set up their tents, they created circles and they put their belongings and other things in between the tents, and they had their own little community, extended family fireplace in the middle. And the ambience, the attitude of people, the level of engagement of people, the motivation to really become much more involved in what we were doing was off the charts in that camp. One of our major problems was not actually getting people to participate in home visiting training. One of our problems was that they had actually wanted us to train people, have them work as home visitors for 2 weeks, and then move them out and have another group come in so that they could be trained, so they could train as many people as possible in preparation for returning to Tigray. I mean, it was a completely different approach. And so years later, when I was meeting with Fred, and I was one of the people who was driving the sacks of, big, huge sacks, this big nylon sacks of Ethiopian burr smuggled across the border as MiGs were flying overhead because you could only drive during the night. We distributed that. And as you were saying earlier, the reason was because there were places where there was famine, but there were other places where there was not. And all we did was to use the money to get the market going again. And that was it. And just get the food moving from one place to the next. And as I was on my way out, I was talking to, and this was in '91, and we had been working with the refugees, Tigrayan refugees in '85. And I stopped and I met with a group of elders to talk to them about how the program was going and whether or not there was something else that we should be doing. And at the end, it was kind of a dark room, a little bit of sunlight coming in from some smaller windows. And as I came out, a younger man came up to me and he says, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "No, I'm sorry. It's the first time I've ever been here in my life. I don't know how I could remember you." He says, "I was in one of the refugee camps that you set up and you were running when you were 5 years ago." And he says, "This time you got it right. This time you helped us before we became refugees. This time we didn't have to leave and sell all of our animals." All right. So I mean, and for Fred, this was really essential. And then this takes me to my last story, with his northern Iraq. And in northern Iraq, Fred wanted to get people out of the mountains back into northern Iraq. But one of the big problems he had was with the UNHCR, who of course have to protect the ability and the mandate of people to seek refuge. Well, Fred knew that they didn't need to stay up there. They shouldn't be staying in refugee camps. And even when we started to bring them down out of the mountains and into camps which we had built, pretty soon the first camp that we had built was filling up. And we knew that we had to have more. And one of the most miserable lives in the world is living in a refugee camp. And one of the things that Fred always used to say is the longer they stay, the less likely they are to leave. And we have to get these people out. And this is one of the points, the last point I'll make with regard to Fred, was that he made the people around him much better. He really supported your own innovation, your own innovative thinking, and he gave you the audacity to kind of like follow, some of your wilder dreams. And with regard to getting, once we started to fill those camps that were in northern Iraq, just below the mountains, he knew that he needed to get them actually all the way home. And he knew that all that they really needed to see was some military people down further. And there was no way that they could really be moved down. And so General Jim Garner understood that it was really his responsibility, because it was still in the no-fly zone, to go down and look at the hook and to see and make sure that it was prepared to receive everyone. So he took down a group of engineers, and I was lucky enough to be the one civilian who went along. And we all went to the governor's office in Dahuk. And we all got our counterpart from the Iraqi military or government there. And we went out and we looked at the electricity, and we looked at the sanitation, and we looked at other distribution points for transporting people if necessary. And we came back, and the Iraqi counterparts all said, well, as you can see, there's still not 40% of the electricity, and there's still not 30% of the roads are not clear. And then General Garner said, well, as you can see, there is at least 60% of the electricity, and there is 40% of whatever, and just played the same numbers back to him. And he said, so in that case, because it's not ready, we're going to have to come down and make sure that it is ready. In other words, he was bringing his engineers to Duhok, and that number of engineers, of course, have to have trigger pullers who are going to protect them. So once those military actually arrived in Duhok, those camps up north emptied out. And so this whole idea of bringing people back and putting them in camps and keeping them along the border disappeared. And the reason was because Fred understood that you had to do everything possible to keep people out of those camps. And I guess I should probably end there.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Okay. So we've got time for, if people keep it short, we have time for 3 comments or questions. This is not a time, short is better than long. So name, who you are, and short, comment or question. I see one hand there. And remember, demerits if it goes on, and I'll cut you off if it goes on for more than 40 seconds. Okay, so who else? I need to see other hands. I want to bunch them together. Sir, please. And this gentleman here.
Tex Harris. I grew up in the same neighborhood with Fred in Dallas. He was about 5 years younger than I was, but we played on the same railroad tracks, and we went in the same graveyards, and we had all these stories. And lo and behold, many years later, when I was in the State Department in a counterpart emergency relief operation that was created in state for dealing with man-made emergencies, Fred came to our rescue and help. And what has not been mentioned here is the antecedents for Fred, Gene Dewey, and so many other people was the disaster in Biafra. That was the kind of sobering reality that we did not have technology. And Fred, as an engineer, as a person of great logic and a belief in the power of analysis and action, felt that he had a ongoing deep responsibility to bring a system and systemization. If you visited his offices in Dallas, there was a library, a book of studies, and this was essentially a breakthrough which went beyond the humanitarian nature of the response into the engineering response. And Fred is responsible. Now, I will unfortunately not tell my Dr. Pepper
All right, we got to cut you off, my friend.
Thank you.
We're going to
all
stop
for holding
there.
this.
Thank you. This gentleman here with the hand, I want to see other hands, please. I want to call on one other person. Go ahead. Sir, the floor is yours.
Doug Brooks, President Emeritus of the International Stability Operations Association, but I learned about Fred Cuny through the William Shawcross article, and I'd just be interested in your take on the effect of that article.
Okay, one more. Can we have someone else? One more? One more. Okay, anybody else? Okay. All right. Okay, this gentleman in the great tie. Great tie, great tie. That's you.
Great tie.
Great tie.
I'm not quite gray. Okay.
Is that a Trump tie? Sorry.
That's a longer story. I'm Jim Scheer, the Wilson Center and the U.S. Army War College. Quick point about Fred. He liked to have walking around money, okay? He wanted money in his pocket. He wanted to create something which he was working on with Morton Sheppy Abramowitz, and I don't know if Ann Richard is in the room, but Ann and I were the newbies working as scribes on this effort. The late Congressman Stephen Solars was key in this too, proposing something called the International Crisis Action Group, ICAG. But he wanted it as a field organization with walking around money to deal precisely with the market issue and other things. The UN, especially in Geneva, was not happy, and we had to back off. despite a lot of efforts to push and indirect workarounds. But I give him great credit. It was actually the entry point for what became the International Crisis Group.
Great, thank you. Okay, any reactions to any of those comments? Brief reactions from the panel.
About the Shawcross article, I think one of the points of that was that he had gotten in over his head or something along the lines of, and that he was trying to get involved in politics. The thing is this, is that, and that I was really quite upset about that perception, because there was also this idea that Fred was looking for position. And there was also a documentary that was done that was pretty good up until the end, when it actually started to make the point that he was desperate for a position in Washington, okay? As Andrew clearly laid out, particularly in northern Iraq, when you have logistical support from an organization such as the U.S. military and a humanitarian operation, I mean, I know humanitarians that were like, the military will never work for them. They went gaga once you asked, offered them a ride in a Black Hawk helicopter, okay? I mean, so what I'm trying to point is, and just also with regard to moving the refugees all the way down and getting them out of those camps and down into Hook, the only way that he could do that is because James Garner, General Garner, listened to him, understood his value as a strategic advisor, and then followed through. That's what Fred wanted to be able to do. That's what he was looking for. He had the ability to analyze and understand what was the best way forward, and he understood the various pieces that need to be played. And when other people wouldn't, he didn't have the patience to stand back and let other people and say, oh, that's okay. I mean, one of the, he was unrelenting.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay.
But anyway,
everyone,
so yes, I do not
comments from
agree
the
with
panel.
Shawcross.
Dina, Dayton, and Greg, 30 seconds each.
Dina, you can't pass. You got to pick up on Jim's point, the International Crisis Action Group was formed based on Fred's talking with Ambassador Abramowitz when he was the ambassador in Turkey. And it was created, the idea for it was created by Fred and Ambassador Abramowitz during that first intervention into northern Iraq. And Mort wanted to have Fred be the key person in the International Crisis Action Group, who would then bring his whole orientation to disaster assistance response to the Crisis Action Group. The last point that I probably would have wanted to make in my presentation was, what if Fred were alive today? What would he be doing? What would he be like? How controversial would he be? How much trouble would he have gotten us into today? How would the U.S. government have reacted to Fred? Say he was the prime person in the International Crisis Action Group, and his strategies would come out through all of the ICAG offices that are established now around the world, which are mostly today simply advisory groups. They're not action groups, even though the word action is in the title. If Fred had been part of that, how mad would he have made lots of people today?
Dina.
No, I don't have a lot to add, just to say that I would agree that everywhere I went with Fred, he chafed at organizational structure and hierarchy. This idea that he would want to run a Washington office of anything is, to me, almost laughable. It just doesn't equate with the person that I knew.
Okay.
Great.
Last word on that is, since I run a big office now, I don't think I could find a cubicle big enough for Fred. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, Ambassador Bill Garveling, come on up here. I'm going to ask the panelists to decamp. I'm going to give Ambassador Bill Garveling and a senior advisor here at CSIS a chance to make a couple of closing remarks, and then we're going to have a reception in the back and all the Dr. Pepper you can drink. So.
Well, thank you for being invited here. I really don't know what I'm going to say now. Following Andrew Natsios and these folks, it's pretty hard to come up with anything to talk about. So I've got a bit of a problem. everybody worked with Fred and knew him. I met Fred in 1985, thanks to two people I know who are here. I was in the aid mission in Bolivia and did a transfer to the Refugee Bureau, thanks to Don Crum, who made that happen, and as mentioned earlier, a guy named Bob Gersoni. And when I got to the Refugee Bureau, Gene Dewey was just about to leave and become the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. And we overlapped for just a short period of time. But once he got to Geneva, he invited me to attend the UNHCR Emergency Managers course. It was a 2-week course at the University of Wisconsin. And I didn't know anything about disaster, anything. So I went. And the principal speaker there was Fred Cuny. So I got to know Fred really well over those 2-week period. And then it was several months after that when a woman named Julia Taft, who many people know, called me up and convinced me, and you know she could be pretty convincing when she wanted to be, to come back to OFDA, which I did. And I was totally dependent on Fred. Every time some disaster would come up and we couldn't figure out what to do, he said, take Fred. And he would come up with reasonable, simple solutions where you'd always kind of think, I should have thought of that. You know, any idiot can think of that. Well, no, you can't. And Fred always came up with the solutions that were simple, practical, and worked. And he's with us in many different ways that people talked about here, but a couple of them, if you have had any contact with OFDA, there's a little red book, The Fog. You didn't like that title, I know, Jim, but if we stayed with the Fog Manual. And that is kind of a handbook of how to do humanitarian assistance and assessments. Well, that started out, I typed up my lecture notes from Fred Cuny from those 2 weeks at the University of Wisconsin, gave that to Tom Fry, who was a U.S. Forest Service guy, and over the course of the next year or two, he went to different agencies of the U.S. government to flesh it out. That red book is really just an elaboration. Well, now it's really big, but the first round is really just an elaboration of Fred's notes and a summary of what he taught for 2 weeks. If you've been in RP, now PRM, and did disaster work, you had this yellow notebook you would carry around, which was kind of goofy to run around a camp with a 3-ring binder, but Fred wrote that in 1985. And I assume there's something new or revisions, but that thing's around somewhere. And I think he was very much involved in the first and second editions of the UNHCR Emergency Manual as well. So the way, certainly the U.S. government and some folks in the UNHCR, the way we all do business, it's all Fred Cuny's thinking and ideas. So he's around us in all different ways. Well, I guess, sorry, I'm supposed to wrap this up a little bit. So I think what I would focus on is 3 or 4 ideas that kind of ran through the presentations from Andrew and the panel. And one that wasn't emphasized much that always struck me is when you have a disaster situation, a lot of people, disaster specialists come in and they talk to each other and they have grand ideas. Cuny would talk to the folks. And it was Fred's view that the people who knew the best solutions, knew the real problems, and could make the solutions work were the people themselves. He never called them victims. They were just people affected by disasters. And he would sit with them and listen and ask questions and pretty much ignore the international experts and all their ideas, which pissed people off. But Fred basically ignored everybody and talked to the folks who were affected. And his goal, of course, was to make them part of designing and implementing their own solutions, which makes great sense. He preceded Bill Easterly by a very long time. And the idea, if you got to work with the communities and pay attention to them. Like I mentioned, simple solutions, and everybody talked about working with the markets. He did that a lot. And one of the people were telling the story about Somalia or Ethiopia and going from Kenya or going from South Sudan or Sudan into Ethiopia to cut the famine off with cash. Well, I was the one dealing with AIDS lawyers at that time. And they said, you want to do what? You want to take dollars and fly to Jeddah, buy Ethiopian birr, come back to Khartoum, and then drive it in to Ethiopia? And we said, yeah, that's what it was. Steve Tisa, if you remember him, almost had a heart attack. He said, you got to be crazy. He said, no, that's what we're going to do. And they said, okay. And when it started, Andrew and I were in Khartoum, and Fred presented this to us. And he said, if you give me $1 million to get this started, we can do this. And you said, okay, you got it. And Fred said, call James Parker. She'll arrange to have the, deal with all the money and all of that. So I got back to Washington. I called Jinx, and she said, we've never handled more than $50,000 in our life. We can't manage this kind of money. What is he talking about? So it took us about a month to find Red Barna, and they would manage the money for this thing that ended up being $15 or $20 million overall. The other things, Mark, you guys didn't know, it was about a week or two after you started driving that stuff across into Ethiopia. I was in Nairobi, and I got a call from Jane Perlez from the New York Times. And she said, tell me this isn't true. There's a bunch of goofy Americans with cars full of Ethiopian birr driving from Sudan into Ethiopia. I said, well, Jane, it's true. But if you write about that, you're going to get some people killed. I said, the deal is, as soon as it's done, we'll tell you, I'll call you, and you can write the first story about it. But just don't do anything with it now. And she honored that. But she was flabbergasted. This can't be true. This is a rumor I'm hearing. Tell me I'm nuts. I said, no, well, actually, it's true. The other theme that runs through this is Cuny really saw disasters as opportunities and the close link with development. And he worked on that long before resilience was ever used, but that's exactly what he was doing, and had a major impact, as everybody described. The other part, Mark touched on it, is Fred was very focused on refugee issues, of course. And one issue was practical protection of refugees, and that meant the role that NGOs and civil society could play as a presence in a camp to help protect the refugees. And he was very focused on that. And then the other issue that he was very, very much focused on, and Mark mentioned that, is how you design a refugee camp. And in my discussions with him, he would say, essentially design it around latrines and systems like that. You don't do it like the military, and you put the latrines at the end, and then everybody who gets out there gets assaulted, and no one will use them. So you put them inside your circle and inside your community, and people will take care of them because they belong to a family or two, and they're safe. And that was one of the arguments with Shalikashvili back in Iraq. They wanted to put up refugee camps just like you build a military camp. And Fred said, not going to happen. That's a bad way to do it. And so the military and Fred clashed big time on that sort of issue. And then finally, these are some of the themes that have been running through things. But Fred was a practitioner, as we all talked about, but he was a writer too. He'd written a couple of books, but he's got a lot of articles that he did with Barry Stein and Pat Reed at Michigan State University. And he did a lot at the University of Wisconsin with Paul Thompson, who did most of the work, I think, the actual writing, and Don Schramm at Wisconsin. So he was tied in to the academic community in a rather surprising way, too. If you look at the list of articles that he authored or co-authored, they're enormous. And he was, very focused on conflict in societies. Long before we talked about fragile and conflict-affected states, he was talking about that, and as everybody mentioned, that was the origin of the Cuny Center, but also with Abramowitz and Lionel Rosenblatt and other folks with the International Crisis Group. Unfortunately, it came into existence shortly after Fred died, so he never actually saw it start on his own. But Fred has been thinking way ahead of all of us for years in the past, and the things that he came up with and the ideas he saw germinated and are coming to play now. And I think all of us who are involved in whether it's humanitarian assistance or development assistance, or both, as Fred would say, have a great debt for Fred. And with that, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Garveling. Please join us out there for reception. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.